Hi all, today we will gonna discuss about SQL. SQL stands for Sequential Query Language or Structured Query Language. Then why do we need this SQL? To interact with the database to do the backend validation. Then what do you mean by this backend validation? It is the process of checking whether the front end data is stored in the backend or not. Was what exactly mean by this means? For example, as a user, I want to create a Facebook account. I will go to the website and I will enter the username, password, mobile number, gender, or whatever it is. As soon as I clicked on the create account button, all my data will get stored in the backend. That is nothing but a DB database to check whether whatever I provided the data in the front end, whether it's correctly stored in the database or not. This process we call as a backend validation. Then SQL is not a programming language, it's a query language mainly used to interact with the database. SQL is not a programming language. Then who are all the users of SQL? First users are database developers. Database developers use the SQL to design and develop the database. To design and develop the database. And database administrator will use the SQL or SQL to provide various roles and responsibilities to the database users. Means, for example, we have 10 database users. Database administrator will define various roles and responsibility for the database users. That means what they can able to do, what they are not able to do, like that they will define the roles and responsibilities. Then database test engineers. Why database test engineers will use the SQL? To do the backend validation. Backend validation. How to do the backend validation? By interacting with the database. What do you mean by this interaction? This interaction is nothing but a CRUD operation. CRUD operations. What do you mean by this CRUD operations? In CRUD, C stands for create or add the data. R stands for read or retrieve the data from database. U stands for update or modify the data. D stands for delete or remove the data. This is we universally known as CRUD operations. That means if we want to create any data inside the database, we have to do create operation. If we want to read the data which is present in the database, we have to do read or retrieve operation. If we want to update the existing data in the database, we have to do update or modify the data in the database. And if we want to delete the data which is already present in the database, these operations we call as CRUD operations. And the next, then the history of SQL. So if we are learning SQL means we should know what's the history of SQL. Okay, SQL was introduced in the year 1970 by the company IBM. Raymond Boyce is called as a father of SQL. EF Cord is a person is known as co-father of SQL. He introduced relational model of database in the year 1970. That's why we called him as a co-father of SQL. In the initial days, SQL was called as a SQL. That means simple English query executable language. In the year 1972, it was got converted into SQL, sequential query language. SQL received the ANSI standards in the year 1972. Then SQL software version, which are all the versions we have currently in the market. 1i, 2i, 3i, these are the versions of up to 9i, these are the versions of SQL. I stands for internet. Similarly, we have 10G, 11G. G stands for grid. Similarly, we have 12C, 18C, 19C, 21C, etc. C stands for cloud. Then the basic terminology. If we are learning any language means we should know some basic terminologies in that language. Similarly, here also we have some basic terminologies. First one is data. What do you mean by this data? Data is a piece or collection of values used to describe a real world object. Used to describe a real world object. For example, here mobile. Mobile is a data. Price is a data. 20k is a data. 20k is a value which describes the real world entity, that is mobile. This 20k value will describe the value of price of this mobile. So this is nothing but a data. Here 20k is data. Similarly, we have color red. Mobile color is black. This black is a data value which describes the color of that mobile. The data becomes useful information if it is processed. That means if it is not processed, then we call it as a raw fact. Here, the 20k black, everything is a raw fact. It's not conveying anything to the user. If we tell 20k, no one going to understand what do you mean by this 20k. Or else if you simply tell black, no one will going to understand what do you mean by that black. Information always contains data, but data will always not always contains useful information. When will this data becomes information means when it's processed. That means if it well 20k is the price of mobile. Price of mobile. Now this thing is conveying something to the user. What it's conveying 20k is the price of mobile. So from raw fact, if we process the raw fact, it will become useful information. Anything that conveys something to the user, we call it as a information or in useful information. The second terminology is database. What do you mean by this database? It's a place used to store the data in systematic and organized way. That means, for example, in library, how we will store the books? We'll have a separate section for novels, similarly for historical books, similarly for science books, right? Why we have to store the books in this way, in systematic and organized way? To access the books easily. If we clump everything, if we arrange the books in a random manner, then user not able to find the particular book in easily we cannot access that book in the library. That's why we will store in a systematic and organized way. Here also in database we will store the data in systematic and organized way to easy access the data. What do you mean by this database? Database is a collection of data. In database contains multiple data, not only single data. It's a collection of data. Database is also known as centralized place. Why we have to call this as a centralized place means database will present in a single place. The user may present in a different place. So all the user from a different place can access the data which is present in a single place. That's why database is called as a centralized place. Then what are the features of database? We can create or add the data into the database. We can read and retrieve the data from database. Similarly, we can update the existing data which is present in the database, and we can delete the data which is present in the database. Then what are the example for this database? For example, we have pen drive. In pen drive, we can store dot JPEG images, dot MP4 files. Similarly, we can store .pdf files, everything, the JPG format or image or MP4 or PDF, all these are data. We are storing a data in database. Similarly, hard disk is an example for database, and all the applications, FB, Insta, or whatever it is. Everything is a database. The third terminology is DBMS. What do you mean by this DBMS? DBMS stands for Database Management System. DBMS is a software used to retrieve the data from the database. That means we have a database. I want to retrieve the data from this database. How I can retrieve? By using DBMS softwares. By using DBMS software, we will write a query using a query language. By using this query language, we can retrieve the data present in the database. This software we call it as a DBMS. DBMS. DBMS mainly we use it to maintain and manage the data present in the database. Then what are the features of DBMS? We can create the database, we can create or add the data into the database, we can read the data which is present in the database, and we can update the data which is already exist in the database, and we can delete the data which is present in the database. And this database, this DBMS will provide authentication to the end users. So that means if you want to access the data, means you have to provide username and password. That means it's provide authentication for the data. If it is providing authentication for the to access the data, means it's providing security for the data. In DBMS, data is stored in the file format. In DBMS, data is stored in file format. For example, .pdf, .xlx, .mp4. The data will be stored in file format. This is the biggest disadvantage of DBMS. Why means we cannot establish a relationship between these two files because it is .pdf file, this is .mp4 file. So we cannot establish relationship between two different files which have different extension. This is the biggest disadvantage of DBMS. To overcome from this disadvantage, we will go for the concept of RDBMS. Then what are the types of DBMS available? NDBMS, nothing but a network DBMS, and HTMS, nothing but a hierarchical DBMS, object oriented DBMS, and relational DBMS. Any DBMS which follows a relational model of database, we call it as a RDBMS. This concept was introduced by EF Code in the year 1970. Hence, we called him as a co-father of SQL. RDBMS stands for Relational Database Management System. Any DBMS which follows a relational model of database, we call it as a RDBMS. What do you mean by this RDBMS? RDBMS also software which uses SQL as a query language. In DBMS we use query language, but here we will use SQL as a query language. By using this SQL language, we will write a query to fetch the data present in a database. Why we need this RDBMS? To maintain and manage the data which is present in the database. Then what are the features of RDBMS? We can create or add the data into the database. Similarly, we can read the data which is present inside the database, and we can update the data, existing data in the database, and we can delete the data from the database. It will also provide the authentication for the database user. If it is providing authentication, means it's providing the security for the data. RDBMS, in RDBMS, data stored in table format. In DBMS, the data will be stored in what? File format. Here, the data will be stored in table format. ID, name, etc. The data will be stored in table format. We can establish a relationship between different tables by using key fields. Key fields, nothing but a primary key and foreign key. We're going to discuss about this primary key. What do you mean by this primary key and foreign key in the upcoming classes? So here we have a table for students. Let us assume this table name as students. Similarly, this table name as percentage. Percentage. So we can establish a relationship between these two tables by using what? Key fields, that is primary key and foreign key. What are the RDBMS software available in the markets? We have Oracle DB, we have MySQL, we have IBM DB2, we have MariaDB. What is the difference between DBMS and RDBMS? So we already discussed about DBMS and RDBMS. Now we're going to discuss about the difference between DBMS and RDBMS. First, DBMS, RDBMS. In DBMS, data is stored in file format. In RDBMS, data is stored in table format. In DBMS, we cannot establish relationship. Relationship. In RDBMS, we can establish a relationship between two or more tables. DBMS stands for Database Management System. RDBMS stands for Relational Database Management System. And DBMS is only suitable for smaller organization. Smaller organization. RDBMS is suitable for smaller as well as larger organization. In DBMS, we cannot apply normalization rules. In RDBMS, we can apply normalization rules. What do you mean by this normalization and normalization rules? We're going to learn in the upcoming sessions. This is all for today. Thank you.